And then I will remind you that two things, really, that there is a reception immediately following this reading in the spa in the basement of Case College Center, right across the green. That's one thing. The other thing is listed on the program schedule. It's a special Saturday event, very unusual for us, a Saturday event. There are two film screenings in the afternoon at 4 and 6:30 in the next door auditorium, in Emerson Auditorium, which is a screening of the Italian film Seduced and Abandoned, which I saw this afternoon after a very, very long time since I've seen it. It is screamingly funny and brilliantly done. So, and tomorrow night at 8:30, following the film screening, the second film screening, Robert Pinksy will be in the auditorium, and we'll have a conversation about it, and some of that conversation with our audience. So, that's a special Saturday event. The poet, says one writer, is like one of those cartoon characters who has stepped off the cliff only to remain suspended. But while the cartoon character's realization of his irrational predicament brings about its fall, for the poet, imagination sustains this position over the abyss. Unquote. The formulation is perhaps a little glib, and yet it does also seem especially tempting when we think about the work of Robert Pinksy. Though he has never seemed to me in more than 25 years of friendship remotely like a cartoon character, he has been a figure on The Simpsons, and and he does often step off one or another cliff and hang impeccably suspended, alert to the abyss below him, but never unduly preoccupied or fearful. And what, you ask, is the abyss where the poet is concerned? It may be, often it is, some nightmare condition or precinct we dare not enter, the territory teeming with creatures of the night that beckon and threaten to derange us or befoul us. Robert is acquainted with that sort of abyss and ventures now and again to look down at it over the edge of the cliff and to risk losing his footing, for example, when he uncovers in himself an attitude decidedly unbecoming and nonetheless tries it on, gives voice to it, allowing it, if only temporarily, to take him where it will. But the cliff's edge in a Pinksy poem typically stands over another kind of abyss, which is best captured when we think of the word exorbitance, the overstepping of certain standard decorums. Often it is said of Robert, it was said of him in a very recent article, that he is still the master of the Horatian middle style, and his work is still marked by the rigors of his early formalism. That's a quote. And yet, he has also become somewhat unruly and unexpected. Try to place him in connection with any traditional school or movement, and you see at once that he just doesn't fit. So that the abyss, where we find it most often beckoning in Robert's work, has principally to do with the risk of the unruly and the formally unassimilable, the juxtaposing of items that clearly do not officially belong together. High and low, Dante and Jackie Robinson, East and West, pop song and aria, the learned and the demotic. Robert remains suspended over the abyss, not because he is indifferent to it or doesn't feel its fatal allure, but because he is forever tempted by things, thoughts, stories, sentiments that are, as he says, impossible to tell and can't be encompassed without overstepping the usual safe boundaries. With some poets, of course, extravagance is a habit or a principle, and we can tell in their work that they proceed with no sense of genuine risk or consequence. Such poets pretend to be risking the fall into the abyss of formlessness or abandon or emotional turmoil when they expect only to be approved and applauded for mastering the stance of the brave, poetic adventurer. But Robert proceeds with an acute sense of the real risks entailed in extravagance, the abyss of unknowing and unsettling and formal derangement is especially compelling and risky to a Pinksy because he is so invested in, among other things, aesthetic beauty, and also in ordinary things, basic human affections, actual persons, and real events, and true memories. So that when he steps off the cliff, he feels that there is a lot to lose, that in venturing off and out, he risks losing a foothold in the beautiful and the real, though in truth, this Robert's readers know. His instincts are impeccable, his footwork as he moves along the edge of the cliff deft, his appetite for falling and losing his balance tempered by his steady attraction to solid ground and solid emotions. Like falling in love, Robert says, the atavistic imperative of some one voice or face. Seductive Robert's music, and seductive the drama he enacts of a man moved in several directions at once, deliberate and free-spirited, at the brink and on point. Robert Pinksy.
Thank you all very much, and thanks to Robert. It is, as always, a tremendous pleasure to be here and to return here. One of the pleasures, a kind of a luxury and honor, is that over the years, I've even less than usual planned what I'm going to read, because I know that the meticulous, imaginative, critical intelligence of Robert Boyers is going to make me think about my own writing. And the plan for the poetry reading will emerge from what Robert has to say. And I have been thinking, while he was talking to us all, I have been thinking about the abyss and being over it. And I believe that, well, for me, one of the ways I interpret that abyss is that we each have, mom and dad, what we did yesterday, the people who invented the English language, which many of our grandparents and great-grandparents didn't speak, all the history that got us to here, speaking this language, to being interested in writing. We've watched Italian movies, we've watched Japanese movies, we have inherited allergies, proclivities, appearances, and the abyss is that moment in which we've been running along, being part of the past, and I don't really believe in the present much, I believe in the past and the future. And the abyss is the moment when you run and you realize you're becoming part of the past every second, and then eventually permanently. And you're figuring out what is your relationship to that past. I know there's a lot of kind of semi-Buddhist cant about living in the present moment. The present moment to me is a delusion. The present moment is like a theoretically dimensionless needle that separates the past from the future. And mostly what you have is the past, and each moment you're coursing into an abyss. In the introduction, Robert quoted someone talking about Horace and the Horatian middle style. I'm not a Latinist. I don't know Horace well, but I know that even in translation and even in stumbling through the Latin, he's arguably the greatest lyric poet who ever lived. And it's like when you're reading Sappho. You feel this is just the pure, absolute thing. And in his case, it's not fragmentary. So I'll read, I don't know if I'm entitled to call it a translation. I'll read my version in which I allow myself to change it a little bit, in which Horace has amazing audacity. It's an ode basically about himself, and it's an ode in which he imagines, in effect, he imagines us here in Saratoga Springs talking about him thousands of years later. And he's quite confident that we'll be doing that. He says a Jewish guy from New Jersey is going to talk about me to a lot of people. So, and I'll read that to you, and then I'll read a poem that is sort of based on this Horace ode. I entitle it Horace's Ode on Horace. Horace's Ode on Horace, second book of Odes, number 20. It won't be any feeble, ordinary wings that I'll rise on up through the ether. I, still a poet, no longer earthbound, triumphing over envy and leaving all human cities far behind. Not I, the son of poor parents, the son of a slave. Not I, who came to know your voice, dear Maecenas. Not I shall perish. I will not wander by the Styx. Look, even now, the skin around my ankles has been transformed as I am changing into a swan. The feathers sprouting from my arms and shoulders are white as snow and sleek for flight. A singing bird, bolder than Icarus, the son of Daedalus. I'll fly high over the shores of the loud Bosphorus. I'll scan Syrtes and the Hyperborean plains. They'll read me in Colchia. The Hungarians will know me. Even remote tribes that claim they don't fear Rome also will come to know me. The well-educated will study my poems in Spain and Germany. Don't give me funeral services. Don't grieve me at all. Spare me the unnecessary tribute of a tomb. I mean, when you say the Horatian middle style, you picture, you imagine somebody saying, I think I will write a poem today, after I play the piano for a bit. And he says, I'm turning into a swan, and basically they're going to read me in L.A. And it's crazy as well as very controlled. His father was a slave, which means something somewhat different from being a slave in the United States of America, but some of the same things. And thinking about that poem of his, I started thinking about the past of others. I started thinking about other figures. So this poem kind of combines Irving Berlin and W.E.B. Du Bois and Horace and other figures. It's as though I'm imagining, the poem is called Chorus. And I've always been interested in reading translations of Greek tragedy, how the chorus speaks. And the chorus often speaks in the first person singular. I. It's the citizens of Thebes or somewhere, but they say I. And they're chanting together in chorus, but it's singular. So I try to imagine these individuals speaking in the first person as though they were a chorus. Chorus. My real name is Israel Belin. My father was a Roman slave who gained his freedom. I was first named Ralph Waldo Ellison, but I changed it to the name of one of your cities because I was born a Jew in Belarusia. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. My other name is Fleckus.
I wrote an essay on the theme, You Choose Your Ancestors. It won't be any feeble, conventional wings that I'll rise on. Not I, born of poor parents. Look, even now the skin around my ankles has been changed. I am growing wings. Across the color line, I summon Aurelius and Aristotle. Threading through Philistine and Amalekite, they come. When I summon them, they come all graciously and without condescension. I took the name Irving, or Caesar, or Creole Jack. Someday they'll study me in Hungary and Los Angeles. So spare me your needless tribute. Spare me the red hideousness of Georgia. I wrote your white Christmas for you. My third name, Burghardt, is Dutch. So for all you know, I am related to Spinoza, Walcott, Pissarro. And in fact, my grandfather Burghardt's first name was Othello. The poem, besides quotations from Horace, has a lot of quotations from W.E. Du Bois, who in his great essay, The Education of Black Folk, at the peroration, he does write that sentence, I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. And he says, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius across the color line. They come graciously. And he says, the red hideousness of Georgia. I'm very attracted to the idea of mixed ancestry, mixed culture. I don't give much credence to the idea of purity. Most things that claim to be pure, it's just lately they've been pure. And if you go back far enough, well, you're pure Irish, but the Irish, a lot of their ancestors are Vikings. Came through and raped the Celts and dominated the Celts. And nothing is pure. Everything is partly something else, and purity is always invented or reinvented. Creole. I'm tired of the gods. I'm pious about the ancestors, afloat in the wake widening behind me in time, the restless devisers. My father had one job from high school till the day he got fired at 30. The year was 1947, and his boss, planning to run for mayor, wanted to hire an Italian veteran, he explained, putting it in plain English. I was 7 years old. My sister was 2. The barbarian tribes in the woods were so savage the empire had to conquer them to clear its perimeter. So, into the woods, Rome sent out missions of civilizing governors and invaders to establish schools, courts, garrisons. Soldiers, clerks, officials, citizens with their household slaves. Years or decades or entire lives were spent out in the hinterlands, those hinterlands which might be good places to retire on a government pension, especially if in those work years you had acquired a native wife. Often I get these things wrong, or at best mixed up, but I do feel piety toward those persistent mixed families in Gaul, Britain, Thrace. When I die, may I take my place in the wedge widening and churning in the mortal ocean of years of souls. As I get it, the Roman colonizing and mixing, the intricate imperial process of enslaving and freeing, involved not just the inevitable fucking in all senses of the word, but also marriages and births. As developers and barbers, scribes and thugs mingled and coupled with the native people and peoples. Begetting and trading, they needed to swap, blend, and improvise languages. Couples especially needed to invent French, Spanish, German, those Creole languages. And I confess, I, Roman barbarian, I find that Creole work more glorious than God. The way it happened, the school sent around a notice. Anybody interested in becoming an apprentice optician, raise your hand. It was the Great Depression. Anything about a job sounded good to Milford Pinksy, who told me he thought it meant a kind of dentistry. Anyway, Milford was bored sitting in study hall, so he raised his hand and he got the job, as was his destiny, full-time after he had graduated. Joe Chavone was the veteran who took the job, not a bad guy. Dr. Weinberg did get elected mayor. Joe worked for him for years. At the bank, an Episcopalian named John Smock, whose family owned a piece of the bank, had played sports with Milford and gave him a small loan with no collateral, so he opened his own shop, grinding lenses and selling glasses. As his mother-in-law said, almost a professional. Optician comes from a Greek word that has to do with seeing. Banker comes from an Italian word for a bench, where people sat, I imagine, and made loans or change. Pinksy, like Tex or Brooklyn, is a name nobody would have if they were still in that same place. Those names all signify someone who's been away from home for a while. Schiavone or Schiavone means Slav or slave. Milford is a variant on the names of poets, Milton, Herbert, Sidney, that certain immigrants used to give their offspring. Creole comes from a word meaning to breed or create in a place. These poems that I've been reading to you are all from a book I'm attempting to finish. I think maybe fits in here. I'll read a book that is from the selected poems that demonstrates what I'm thinking about, that abyss that you run over and look around, and before you fall, what you have to say is the equivalent of the coyote's legs moving a little bit before he goes all the way down. The past. One of the main ways the past that came to me early in my life was sitting around listening to aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents and great aunts and great uncles telling family history and stories. And it was so confusing. They never started at any beginning. They never finished. They always picked up in the middle. It was always elusive. It was exactly like reading modern poetry. What was... And you would try, when you think you had figured out, you realize, no, you hadn't studied it right, or it was just formally very confusing. And thinking about those conversations, I realized that they were indeed a model of knowledge and of history, and that everything we know is in that confused, constantly revised, bewildered and bewildering form. And it's never orderly. My paternal grandfather had a wife, she died young, that was a love match. Then he married, the family gave him her cousin, who was not as attractive, to raise his kids. And he gave the cousin 2 kids, and then she was in a mental hospital for the rest of her life, and he was living with the barmaid. And by the time I knew him, he had married the barmaid of his bar, and blah, blah. And when it comes at you in these fragments, and it is itself disorderly, and then it's told in a disorderly manner, it leads to writing a poem called Poem with Lines in Any Order. Poem with lines in any order. Sonny said, then he shouldn't have given Molly the 2 more babies. Dave's sister and her husband adopted the baby, and that was Babe. You can't live in the past. Sure, Dave was a tough guy, but he was no hero. Sonny and Toots went to live for a while with the Bragers. It was a time when it seemed like everybody had a nickname. Nobody can live in the future. When Rose died having Babe, Dave came after the doctor with a gun. Toots said, "What would you expect? He was a young man, and there she was." Sonny, still a kid himself, when Dave moved out on Molly. The family gave him Rose's cousin Molly as a wife to raise the children. There's no way to just live in the present. In their 80s, Toots and Sonny still arguing about their father. Dave living above the bar with Della and half the family. So if it's confusing, it's confusing. I'll risk another family anecdote. That poem was published a couple of years ago in the New Yorker magazine. And the way I knew it had been published in the New Yorker is that I got an email from my sister saying, "No, that's all wrong." That no, it wasn't Babe, it was Toots. Toots was, Thelma was Toots, Babe was... My sister, incidentally, is not a hillbilly. She's an art expert. But I had to say to her, "You know, Susan, it's a poem. People make things up." She said, "I just couldn't stand it." Here's a more recent poem called "Running with Noodles." Running with noodles. Tomatl, imported from Mexico, was once thought poisonous until a parson disproved the misconception by eating a tomato in church. But that old tale is itself misleading, a legend, like George Washington destroying a cherry tree. Tomatl, cousin of deadly nightshade, non-toxic, exotic. Columbus brought Italy the pomodoro, as Marco Polo brought the noodle from Asia. In old American movies, they sometimes say tomato meaning a woman, a word like cupcake, casual contempt we know to hiss at today. Back then, my grandma called Italian people noodles. Spaghetti with red sauce is Aztec and Chinese. Noodles from the East, gold apples from the West. Creole inventions that time makes pure. Tipico Italiano. So Nana could warn me in Yiddish about Joe Cittadino. "Robbie, don't run with the Luxians." Doro must mean those first imports were yellow, and breeding made them red. Or maybe the name is another misapprehension. Only the Sibyl knows, who wrote it on a leaf lost in the wind. That's another way of saying the same thing as poem with lines in any order. Having mentioned my grandmother, who had a lot to do with raising me, times where my mother was ill or unavailable, my grandmother, who lived 4 doors away, she was my functional mom sometimes. Improvisation on Yiddish. Improvisation on Yiddish. Before I started reading, Honor Moore commented on my old-fashioned way of keeping my poems in a binder, and I haven't mastered the skill of keeping the
pages open to the right page. Improvisation on Yiddish, which is the name of the poem that I'm going to read to you here at this poetry reading that you came to, that I am giving to you, with poems such as Improvisation on Yiddish included amongst the list of poems I read to you. Improvisation on Yiddish. I've got you in my pocket. Ich hab mir verpackt. It sees me, and I cannot spell it. Ich hab dich in Bud, which means I see you as if you were in the bathtub, naked. I know you completely. Hab dich in Bud. Kishkas, guts. Tongue of the guts. Tongue of the heart, naked. The guts of the tongue. Bube lotion. Tongue of my grandmother that I can't spell in these characters I know. I know Hubdik and Bud, which means I see you and through you. Tongue of irony. Intimate tongue of the dear and the dead. Tongue of death. Tongue of laughing in the guts, naked and completely. Bubelotion. Lost tongue of the lost. Get away from me, which means come closer. Geh weg von mir. Ich hab dich in Bud. I see you completely, naked. I've got you in my pocket. Grief. I don't think anybody ever is really divorced, said Lenny. Also, I don't think anybody ever is really married, he said. Because English was really Lenny's second language, and because of Yiddish and its displaced place in the world, he never really believed in his own prose. He wrote sentences as a great boxer moves. Near the end, he told me, I'm in hell. Something Lenny might have said about hunting for a parking space in Berkeley. Mike, too, was himself. His last month, too weak to paint or make prints, he sat and made drawings of flowers, his ink attentive to rhythms of beach rose, wisteria, lily, forms like acrobats or Cossack dancers. Mike had a vision of his body dead on his studio floor, seen from high above. He didn't feel sad or afraid on seeing it, he said, just sorry for the person who would find it. You can't say nobody ever really dies. Of course they do. Lenny died. Mike died. But the odd thing is, the person still makes a shape distinct and present in the mind as an object in the hand. The presence in the absence. It isn't comfort, it's grief. Because I'm here at the Writers Institute, where it feels relatively safe, I'm reading mostly kind of recent work to you. I'll read my most recent poem to you. It's a kind of a tribute to the late artist George Segal. It occurs to me that George Segal's sculptures are a lot like fiction and poetry. It's sometimes an insult to an artist to say the work is literary. It's kind of literary. It's a diminishment. But his relation to the ordinary, we're very often in writing, what we're trying to do is tell some ordinary thing, like how your grandmother spoke, or your clothes, or whatever you see around you, and you try to say it in a way that makes it like old heroic art, makes it seem profound.
It's about what we call the ordinary, or was sometimes called the ordinary, but it treats the ordinary as though it has its own, as though heroic or epic stature. This poem is called Genesis According to George Siegel. Genesis According to George Siegel. The Spirit brooded on the water and made the earth and molded us out of earth. And then the Spirit breathed itself into our nostrils and rested. What was the Spirit waiting for? An image of its nature? A looking glass? Glass is also made of dust, of sand and fire. Ordinary, enigmatic, we people waiting in the bus terminal. The survivor at the wire, also waiting. Behind him, a tangle of bodies made out of plaster, which plasterers call mud. The apprentice hurries with his hod of mud. Particulate sand for glass, particulate milled flour for bread. What are we waiting for? The hourglass that measures all our time in trickling dust is also made out of dust and will return to dust. So an old poem says. Men in a bread line out in a dusty street are silent, waiting at the apportioning place of daily bread. At an old-fashioned radio in a wooden case, a man sits listening in a wooden chair. A woman at a butcher block waits to cut. What are we waiting for in the cloud of dust? Or waiting for the past, particles of being settled and moist with fire, settled and moist with life, then brittle again. I'll read one more poem I'll read three more poems. I'll read one from this Here Now book in progress, and then I'll close with a couple from selected poems. I think it's one of the virtues available to a poetry reading or reading of any kind would be to be brief. So I'll read three more poems to you. I'll be explicit. In this poem, a version of myself as a rather sour old man. A version of myself as a rather sour old man, unlike the sweet old man I actually am. He thinks of the past that he spent his life thinking about, all the works of art. He thinks of it as a city. The city. I live in this little village of the present, but lately I forget my neighbors' names. More and more, I spend my days in the city, the great metropolis where I can hope to glimpse great spirits as they cross the street, souls durable as the cockroach and the lungfish. When I was young, I lived in a different village. We had parades, the circus, the nearby fort, and Rabbi Gewirtz invented a game called baseball. To reach first base, you had to chant 2 lines of Hebrew verse correctly. Mistakes were outs. 1 strike for every stammer or hesitation. We boys were thankful for the rabbi's grace, his balancing the immensity of words written in letters of flame by God himself with our mere baseball, the little things we knew. Or do I remember wrong? Did we boys think, there were no girls, that baseball was the city, and that the language we were learning by rote, little attention to meaning now and then, was small and local? The major leagues, the city. One of the boys was killed a few years later, wearing a uniform, thousands of miles away. He was a stupid boy. When I was captain, if somehow he managed to read his way to first, I never let him attempt the next 2 lines to stretch it for a double. So long ago. Sometimes I think I've never seen the city. That where I've been is just a shabby district where I persuade myself I'm at the center. Or atrocities, beheadings, mass executions, troops ordered to rape and humiliate. The news, the Psalms, the epics. What if that's the city? Gewürz, he told us, means a dealer in spices, anise and marjoram used for embalming corpses, for preserving or enhancing food and drink. The stuff of civilization, like games and verses. The other night I dreamed about that boy, the foolish one who died in the course of war. He pulled his chair up so he faced the wall. I wanted him to read from the prayer book. He wouldn't answer. He wouldn't play the game. So I'll read 2 poems from selected poems. I think cleaving to the theme of running out, and here's the past behind you as you're about to become part of it. The forgetting. The forgetting I notice as I get older is really a form of memory. The undergrowth of things unknown to you young that I have forgotten. Memory of so much crap, jumbled with so much that seems to matter. Lieutenant Calley, Captain Easy, Mei-Ling Sung, Sibi Sisti, and all the forgettings that preceded my own. Baghdad, Egypt, Greece, the plains, centuries of lootings of antiquities, obscure atrocities. Imagine a tent filled with mostly kids yelling for poetry. In fact, it happened. I was there in New Jersey at the famous poetry show. I used to wonder, what if the Baseball Hall of Fame overflowed with too many thousands of greats, all in time unremembered? Hardly anybody can name all 8 of their great-grandparents. Can you? Will your children's grandchildren remember your name? You'll see, you little young jerks. Your favorite music and your political furors, too, will need to get sorted in dusty electronic corridors. In 1972, Joanne Lai was asked, what are the lasting effects of the French Revolution? Too soon to tell. Remember? Or was it Mao Zedong? Poetry made out of air strains to reach back to begats, and suspiring forward into air, grunting to beget the hungry or overfed future. Ezra Pound praises the emperor who appointed a committee of scholars to pick the best 450 no plays and destroy all the rest. The fascist. The stand-up master, Stephen Wright, says he thinks he suffers from both amnesia and déjà vu. Quote, I feel like I have forgotten this before. Who remembers the arguments when jurors gave Ezra Pound the only prize for poetry awarded by the United States government until then? I was in the big tent when the guy read his poem about how the Jews were warned to get out of the Twin Towers before the planes hit. The crowd was applauding and screaming. They were happy. It isn't that they were anti-Semitic or anything. They just weren't listening. Or no, they were listening, but that certain way. In it comes, you hear it, and that self-same second, you swallow it or expel it. An ecstasy of forgetting. And I'll close with a poem. I'll close with this poem in defiance of the way if a poem that by a writer has been put in a lot of anthologies, or it's the poem people have read, then you're supposed to be sick of it because, that. But I defy that part because I don't feel it. So I will read a poem very consciously thinking about the inherent pastness of just about everything, and how any ordinary thing in an historical context, as I said about those sculptures of George Siegel, it becomes the history of the world. Almost anything is a portal into the whole history of the world. Shirt. The back, the yoke, the yardage. Lapped seams. The nearly invisible stitches along the collar turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians, gossiping over tea and noodles on their break, or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff eye button at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the ringer, the mangle, the needle, the union, the treadle, the bobbin, the code, the infamous blaze at the Triangle Factory in 1911. 146 died in the flames on the 9th floor. No hydrants, no fire escapes. The witness in a building across the street who watched how a young man helped a girl to step up to the windowsill, then held her out away from the masonry wall and let her drop. And then another, as if he were helping them up to enter a streetcar and not eternity. A third, before he dropped her, put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. Almost at once, he stepped to the sill himself. His jacket flared and fluttered up from his shirt as he came down, air filling up the legs of his gray trousers, like Hart Crane's bedlamite, shrill shirt ballooning. Wonderful how the pattern matches perfectly across the placket and over the twin bar-tacked corners of both pockets, like a strict rhyme or a major chord. Prints, plaids, checks, houndstooth, tattersall, madras, the clan tartans invented by mill owners inspired by the hoax of Ashen to control their savage Scottish workers, tamed by a fabricated heraldry. MacGregor, Bailey, McMartin. The kilt devised for workers to wear among the dusty, clattering looms, weavers, carders, spinners, the loader, the docker, the navvy, the planter, the picker, the sorter sweating at her machine in a litter of cotton as slaves in calico head rags sweated in fields. George Herbert, your descendant is a black lady in South Carolina. Her name is Irma, and she inspected my shirt. Its color and fit and feel and its clean smell have satisfied both her and me. We have culled its cost and quality down to the buttons of stimulated bone, the buttonholes, the sizing, the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shirt. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Many thanks.